The morning mist hung heavy over Westminster, as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her wheelchair one final time before approaching the imposing gates of Parliament. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold October air, but from the weight of what she was about to do. 3 months earlier, she had been just another face in the crowd, a 34-year-old teacher from Manchester living a quiet life with her husband David and their twin daughters. That was before the accident that changed everything. The lorry had come, out of nowhere on that rainy Tuesday evening. Sarah remembered the screech of brakes, the sickening crunch of metal, and then nothing but darkness. When she woke up in the hospital 6 weeks later, the doctors delivered news that shattered her world. The damage to her spine was severe and permanent. She would never walk again. But it wasn't just her own tragedy that brought her to Parliament that day. During her long recovery, Sarah had discovered something that made her blood boil. The safety regulations that might have prevented her accident had been sitting on a government desk for 2 years, gathering dust while politicians debated costs and implementation timelines. Hundreds of people had suffered similar fates while bureaucrats shuffled papers and held endless meetings. The media had picked up her story after she wrote a passionate letter to the local newspaper. Soon, reporters were calling. Disability rights. Groups were reaching out, and suddenly Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight as the face of road safety reform. She hadn't asked for this role, but she embraced it with the fierce determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Standing before Parliament now, Sarah felt the eyes of dozens of journalists and supporters upon her. The Royal Guard, Captain James Morrison, approached her wheelchair with a respectful nod. Parliament had agreed to allow her entry, but the building's accessibility was limited. The ancient structure, with its countless steps and narrow doorways, seemed designed to keep people like her out. "Ma'am, if you'll permit me," Captain Morrison said gently, his voice carrying the authority of years of service to the Crown. Without waiting for a response, he carefully lifted Sarah from her wheelchair, cradling her with surprising gentleness for such a large man. The crowd fell silent as this extraordinary scene unfolded. As they climbed the stone steps together, Sarah closed her eyes and thought of all the people who couldn't be here today. The families torn apart by preventable accidents, the children who would grow up without parents, the dreams cut short by negligence and political inaction. She carried their stories with her, their pain fueling her resolve. The heavy oak doors of Parliament swung open, and Sarah found herself in the grand hallway where centuries of history had been made. The marble floors gleamed under ornate chandeliers, and portraits of past prime ministers gazed down from gilded frames. This was the heart of British democracy, where laws were made and lives were shaped by the stroke of a pen. Captain Morrison set her down gently in a chair that had been specially arranged near the visitors' gallery. As he stepped back, Sarah caught his eye and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once, his face stern but his eyes kind. In that moment, she realized that her journey to this place had already begun to change things, even before she had spoken a single word. The chamber was filling with MPs, their voices creating a low murmur that echoed off the ancient walls. Sarah spotted the Prime Minister taking his place at the dispatch box, shuffling through his notes with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He had no idea that his carefully planned afternoon was about to be derailed by a woman who had refused to be silenced by tragedy. The Speaker of the House called for order as the afternoon session began. Sarah watched from her position in the gallery as MPs settled into their green leather benches, many of them completely unaware that their routine day was about to take an unprecedented turn. She had been granted the extraordinary privilege of addressing Parliament directly, something that rarely happened for ordinary citizens. Prime Minister Robert Thornfield stood at the dispatch box, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit immaculate. He was known for his commanding presence and sharp wit in debates. At 58, he had spent nearly 3 decades in politics, climbing steadily through the ranks with careful calculation and unwavering ambition. Today's session was meant to be straightforward, a discussion of routine transportation budgets that would likely empty half the chamber by tea time. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched the formal proceedings unfold. The antiquated language and ceremonial gestures felt surreal after everything she had been through. These people lived in a world of traditions and protocols, while real people suffered in hospital beds and morgues because of their delays and indecision. The Prime Minister began his speech with the usual pleasantries, thanking various committees, and acknowledging the hard work of civil servants. His voice carried easily through the chamber, polished by years of public speaking. He moved on to discuss infrastructure investments and economic benefits, painting a picture of steady progress and responsible governance. But Sarah noticed something in his demeanor that made her lean forward in her chair. Despite his confident exterior, there was a tension in his shoulders, a slight hesitation when he mentioned road safety improvements. He knew she was there. The media attention surrounding her visit had been impossible to ignore, and his advisors had undoubtedly briefed him on the potential political implications. The government remains committed to improving road safety across the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister declared, his voice rising slightly. We have allocated substantial resources to this vital issue and continue to work with industry experts to implement comprehensive solutions. Sarah felt her jaw clench. Substantial resources that had been tied up in red tape for years. Comprehensive solutions that existed only on paper while people died on dangerous roads every single day. She thought of her own daughters, who now had to help their mother with tasks she used to do without thinking. She thought of David, who worked extra shifts to pay for modifications to their home and car. The chamber was half empty now, with many MPs having quietly slipped away to attend to other business. Those who remained seemed more interested in checking their phones than listening to another routine transportation speech. This was exactly what Sarah had expected, this casual indifference to matters of life and death. When the Prime Minister finished his prepared remarks, the speaker announced that there would be an opportunity for questions and comments from the floor. This was Sarah's moment, the chance she had fought for through weeks of phone calls, letters, and media interviews. As she was helped to her feet and positioned at the microphone that had been specially arranged for her, a hush fell over the chamber. Even the most distracted MPs looked up from their devices, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The Prime Minister's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see his hands grip the dispatch box slightly tighter. She looked out, at the sea of faces before her, some curious, others impatient, a few showing genuine interest in what she might say. Behind all of them, she could feel the weight of history, of all the momentous decisions that had been made in this very room. Now it was her turn to make history, to speak truth to power, in a way that these walls had rarely witnessed. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to speak, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She had practiced these words countless times, but now they carried the full force of her experience, her pain, and her determination to prevent others from suffering as she had. Honorable members of Parliament, Sarah began, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade through silk. 3 months ago, I could walk into this building on my own 2 feet. Today, I was carried in by a royal guard because your government's delays have consequences that reach far beyond these walls. A ripple of surprise went through the chamber. This was not the usual polite, deferential tone that visitors typically used when addressing Parliament. Sarah's words carried raw emotion and unflinching honesty that immediately commanded attention. Even the MPs who had been preparing to leave found themselves frozen in their seats. The Prime Minister's face remained carefully composed, but Sarah could see the slight narrowing of his eyes. He hadn't expected such a direct challenge from someone who was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to speak. Prime Minister, you speak of substantial resources and comprehensive solutions, Sarah continued, her gaze fixed directly on him. But I have in my possession documents that tell a very different story. Safety regulations for heavy goods vehicles, approved by your own transport committee, have been sitting in government offices since March 2022. 23 months, Prime Minister. 23 months while people like me paid the price for your inaction. She reached into the folder beside her and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The rustling sound seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent chamber. These weren't just documents to Sarah. They were evidence of a system that valued bureaucracy over human life. In those 23 months, there have been 847 serious accidents involving heavy goods vehicles on UK roads. 236 people have died. 611 have been seriously injured. Many like me will never fully recover. Her voice grew stronger with each statistic, each number representing a shattered life and a grieving family. The Prime Minister shifted uncomfortably at the dispatch box. His advisors in the gallery were frantically checking their phones and tablets, trying to verify the information Sarah was presenting. They knew that every word she spoke was being recorded, broadcast live, and would be analyzed endlessly by the media. But these aren't just numbers, are they, Prime Minister? Sarah's voice took on an edge that made several MPs lean forward in their seats. They're teachers like me, who won't be returning to their classrooms. They're parents who won't see their children graduate. They're sons and daughters who won't come home for Christmas. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the chamber. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the old building settling on its foundations. I've read the reports, Prime Minister. I've spoken to the engineers, the safety experts, the families of victims. Do you know what they all say? They say these accidents were preventable. Every single one of them could have been avoided if the safety regulations gathering dust in your offices had been implemented when they were supposed to be. The Prime Minister cleared his throat, preparing to respond, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had traveled too far and fought too hard to be interrupted by political pleasantries. I want to read you something, Prime Minister, she said, holding up a letter with hands that no longer trembled. This is from Emma Peterson in Glasgow. Her husband Mark was killed 6 weeks ago when his car was crushed by a lorry whose brakes failed on the M8, she writes. My children ask me every night when Daddy is coming home. How do I explain to a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old that Daddy isn't coming home because someone in an office decided that paperwork was more important than lives? The chamber was so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She looked around at the faces staring back at her and saw something she hadn't expected. Shame, not in all of them, but in enough to give her hope that her words were having an impact. Emma's children will grow up without their father because of decisions made in this very building. Because bureaucrats prioritized process over people. Because politicians worried more about budgets than bodies. Sarah's voice rose with controlled anger, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. The Prime Minister's face had gone pale. His usual confident demeanor had cracked, revealing the human being underneath the political facade. He gripped the dispatch box with both hands now, his knuckles white with tension. Sarah reached for another document from her folder, this one bearing the official seal of the Department for Transport. The paper crinkled in the silence as she unfolded it, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder. This is your department's own risk assessment, Prime Minister, dated January 15, 2023. It clearly states that delaying implementation of the heavy goods vehicle safety regulations would likely result in preventable casualties. Your own experts warned you, and yet here we are, 8 months later, still waiting. The Prime Minister's press secretary in the gallery was frantically taking notes, already crafting damage control statements for the media storm that was certain to follow. But in the chamber itself, time seemed suspended as Sarah continued her relentless presentation of facts. I've also brought photographs, Prime Minister. Would you like to see what your delays look like in real terms? She held up a picture of twisted metal and broken glass, the remains of her own car after the accident. This used to be my Honda Civic. I was driving home from my daughter's school play when a lorry with faulty brakes couldn't stop in time. Several MPs visibly winced at the image. The abstract concept of road safety statistics had suddenly become viscerally real through Sarah's presentation. This wasn't a policy debate anymore. It was a human tragedy unfolding in real time. But I'm not here just to show you pictures or read you statistics. Sarah continued, her voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful. I'm here because I discovered something that should make every person in this chamber ashamed to draw their salary from the public purse. She pulled out yet another document, this one marked with highlighting and sticky notes from hours of research. The Prime Minister watched her movements with the wariness of a man who knew he was about to be cornered. Your government has spent more money on the catering budget for this building in the past year than it would cost to implement every single safety regulation currently under review. Let me repeat that, Prime Minister. You've spent more on sandwiches, and T than it would take to save hundreds of lives. The comparison hit the chamber like a physical blow. The absurdity and callousness of the situation was laid bare in terms that even the most detached politician couldn't ignore. Sarah could see MPs exchanging uncomfortable glances, some shaking their heads in what appeared to be genuine disgust. While my family struggles to pay for wheelchair ramps and bathroom modifications, while Emma Peterson's children go to bed hungry because their mother can't work full-time while grieving, while hundreds of families across this country live with the consequences of preventable tragedies, you debate the merits of spending money that amounts to less than what this government spends on office supplies in a month. The Prime Minister finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. Ms. Mitchell, I want to assure you that the government takes road safety very seriously. There are complex considerations involved in implementing new regulations, including economic impact assessments and consultation with industry stakeholders. Sarah's eyes blazed with fury at his response. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak she had expected. But hearing it delivered with such casual indifference after everything she had shared made her blood boil. Complex considerations? She repeated, her voice rising. Economic impact assessments? Prime Minister, I am the economic impact. Emma Peterson is the economic impact. Every family destroyed by preventable accidents is your economic impact assessment. Come to life. She leaned forward in her chair, her gaze locked on his face. You want to talk about industry stakeholders? I'll tell you about stakeholders, Prime Minister. They're the children who will never see their parents again. They're the spouses learning to live alone. They're the workers who will never return to their jobs because politicians like you decided that consultation periods were more important than human lives. The chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers. Several MPs were nodding in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The speaker called for order, but his voice seemed weak compared to the moral authority that Sarah had claimed for herself. The Prime Minister's face had gone from pale to red, a flush of anger and embarrassment creeping up his neck. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone who couldn't be dismissed with the usual political tactics. Prime Minister, Sarah said, her voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. I want you to look at me. Really look at me. 3 months ago, I was chasing my daughters around the playground. I was standing in front of my classroom teaching children about history and literature. I was dancing with my husband in our kitchen while we cooked dinner together. The Prime Minister's eyes met hers reluctantly, and she could see him struggling to maintain his political composure in the face of such raw human truth. Now I need help to get dressed in the morning. My 6-year-old daughter has to reach things from high shelves because Mummy can't stand up anymore. My husband sleeps on the couch because our bedroom is upstairs and we can't afford to move. This is what your delays look like, Prime Minister. This is the human cost of your careful considerations and consultation periods. The silence in the chamber was so complete that Sarah could hear someone's stomach rumbling 3 rows back. Every eye was fixed on her, every ear straining to catch her words. Even the hardest political veteran seemed moved by the quiet dignity of her pain. But I didn't come here to make you feel sorry for me, Sarah continued, straightening in her chair. I came here to make you understand that your power comes with responsibility. Every day you delay, people die. Every meeting you postpone, families are destroyed. Every consultation period you extend, children lose their parents. She reached for her final document, the one she had saved for this moment. It was a petition signed by thousands of people across the country who had heard her story and demanded action. I have here the signatures of 127,000 British citizens who demand immediate implementation of road safety regulations. These aren't political activists or special interest groups. These are ordinary people who are tired of watching their fellow citizens suffer while politicians play games with their lives. The number hung in the air like a challenge. 127,000 voters, 127,000 voices demanding change. 127,000 people who would remember how their representatives responded to this moment. Prime Minister, you have a choice to make right now, in front of all these witnesses in front of the cameras broadcasting this session across the nation. You can continue hiding behind bureaucratic excuses and political calculations, or you can be the leader this country needs you to be." The Prime Minister's hands were shaking slightly now, a tremor that he tried to hide by gripping the dispatch box tighter. His usual arsenal of political deflections and practiced responses seemed utterly inadequate in the face of Sarah's moral clarity. The regulations are written, the safety measures are designed, the cost has been calculated and approved. All that's missing is your signature on an implementation order. How many more people have to die while you decide whether signing your name is worth the political risk? Sarah's voice grew stronger as she approached her crescendo, every word carefully chosen for maximum impact. She had studied rhetoric and debate as a teacher, but this wasn't about academic theory. This was about using every tool at her disposal to save lives. You sat in this very chamber last month and spoke about British values. You talked about compassion, about protecting the vulnerable, about building a society that takes care of its own. Those weren't just pretty words for the evening news, were they, Prime Minister? They were promises. Promises to people like me, like Emma Peterson, like the 127,000 citizens who signed this petition. The Prime Minister opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his political career, he was genuinely at a loss for words. The usual sound bites and practiced phrases seemed not just inadequate, but almost insulting in the face of such profound human suffering. "I'm going to ask you a simple question, Prime Minister," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above, a whisper, forcing everyone in the chamber to strain to hear her. "And I want you to answer me as a human being, not as a politician. If your daughter was lying in a hospital bed, paralyzed because of safety regulations that could have been implemented years ago, what would you do?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over the Prime Minister's head. The chamber had never been so quiet, the weight of Sarah's words pressing down on every person present. For a long moment, Robert Thornfield stood frozen at the dispatch box, his face cycling through emotions that his political training had taught him to hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely recognizable. Gone was the practiced confidence, the polished delivery that had carried him through decades of political battles. In its place was something raw and human that few people in that chamber had ever heard from him before. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, then stopped, his throat working as if the words were physically painful to produce. I have 2 daughters." The admission seemed to cost him something vital. Sarah watched as his political mask finally slipped completely, revealing the father underneath the Prime Minister. "If it were my daughter," he continued, his voice growing stronger but no less emotional, "I would move heaven and earth. I would tear down every barrier, challenge every delay, fight every system that stood between her and justice." The chamber erupted in whispers and murmurs, but the Prime Minister held up his hand for silence. His eyes never left Sarah's face as he continued speaking. "You asked me to answer as a human being rather than a politician, and the truth is that somewhere along the way, I forgot there was supposed to be a difference." His voice cracked slightly on the word difference, and several MPs shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah felt tears she didn't know she had been holding back start to flow down her cheeks. This wasn't the victory she had expected, but it was something more powerful, genuine human recognition of the pain she represented. "I have spent so many years thinking about political consequences, about economic implications, about party positions, that I lost sight of the most basic truth of governance. That every decision we make affects real people with real lives and real families." The Prime Minister's hands were trembling openly now as he reached into his jacket pocket. "Ms. Mitchell, I want to make you a promise, here in front of these witnesses, in front of the cameras, in front of God and country." He pulled out his phone and began dialing a number with shaking fingers. "I am calling the Secretary of State for Transport right now. Those safety regulations will be fast-tracked for immediate implementation." The chamber exploded into chaos. MPs jumped to their feet, some cheering, others shouting questions. Journalists in the gallery were frantically scribbling notes and making their own phone calls. But Sarah heard none of it. She was focused entirely on the man at the dispatch box who was speaking rapidly into his phone, giving orders that would save countless lives. "Jonathan, it's Robert," the Prime Minister said into his phone, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sound system. "I need the heavy goods vehicle safety regulations implemented immediately. Not next month, not after further consultation, immediately. Override whatever bureaucratic obstacles exist. I'll take full responsibility for any political fallout." When he hung up the phone, the Prime Minister looked directly at Sarah, with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. "The implementation order will be signed by close of business today. The regulations will take effect within 30 days. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the weight of months of fighting, of pain, of grief, finally begin to lift from her shoulders. When she opened them again, she saw something she had never expected to see in the House of Commons. A room full of politicians who looked genuinely ashamed of themselves. "Thank you, Prime Minister," she said simply. "You'll never know how many families you've just saved from going through what mine has endured." As Captain Morrison approached to help her from the chamber, Sarah looked around one final time at the ancient walls that had witnessed this moment of transformation. She had come here carried by a royal guard, unable to walk but determined to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The media would later call it one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered in Parliament. Political analysts would debate its impact on future elections and policy decisions. But for Sarah Mitchell, the measure of success was much simpler. Somewhere in the country, a family would remain whole because a teacher from Manchester refused to accept that bureaucracy was more important than human life. 3 weeks later, the new safety regulations prevented what traffic investigators determined would have been a catastrophic multi-vehicle accident on the M25. The lorry's enhanced braking system, mandated by the regulations Sarah had fought for, allowed the driver to stop just in time. 4 families went home safely that night, never knowing how close they had come to tragedy, never knowing they owed their intact lives to a woman in a wheelchair who had the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most.